On the morning of March 26, 1991, 5 boys set out to search for frog eggs in the hills of Mount Waryong, a gentle mountain in Daegu, South Korea. But by the end of the day, they were nowhere to be found. For over a decade, their fate remained a mystery until a shocking discovery in 2002. Their remains were found just 2 kilometers from their homes, on the very mountain they said they would be at. But this raised more questions than answers, because if it was a mere accident, why were their bones found to have fracture wounds and scratches? And more shockingly, why were their clothes tied up as if being prepared for execution? The public was outraged, and distrust of institutions began to fester. How did the extensive search by the police not find the boys' remains earlier? Why did South Korean authorities try to wrap up the case so quickly? Was the military involved? And finally, what exactly happened to the frog boys of South Korea? This is a case of police mishandling, hoaxes, cover-ups, and conspiracies that led it to be one of the most haunting unsolved cases in South Korea. Much of tonight's episode is based on this documentary by CNA Insider. Find the link in the description. March 26, 1991. It was a school holiday for the elections. 5 boys, Kim Jong-sik, Kim Yong-yu, Woo Chol-won, Jo Ho-yeon, and Park Chan-in, set out in search of salamander eggs. Despite this, the media mistakenly reported that they went looking for frog eggs instead, hence the name of the case, the Frog Boys. The boys were as close as brothers. They were neighbors, so they saw each other almost every day. At 9 a.m, the boys set out. This would be the last time their parents would see them. By the early afternoon at 1 p.m, one of the boys' father, Mr. Wu, received a call from his son's taekwondo class. The boy hadn't shown up, and soon the other parents realized that none of the 5 boys had returned from their little adventure. A neighborhood friend had seen the boys heading towards Mount Waryong, which is a gentle 300-meter hill that the boys knew very well. The hill had an army base on one side and a military shooting range above the pond where the children were heading. The parents, who were now anxious, climbed the mountain themselves in search of their sons. However, they found no trace of their kids. By late evening, the local police had been notified that 5 boys were missing on Mount Waryong, but they were skeptical about the claim. The police didn't treat it as an emergency. The first election in 30 years was taking place that day, and they had more important things to worry about than 5 kids running away from home. So they simply told the parents to wait. Minutes turned to hours, turned to days. Word started to spread through Daegu about 5 boys who had suddenly gone missing. The parents grew increasingly anxious. Then, 3 days later, an ominous call was made to one of the boys' homes. Jong-sik. It was a ransom call.
애들 데리고 있습니다. 엄청 고통스러워하고 있거든요. 애들 2명은 되게 아파요 지금.
The voice demanded that the parents bring a large sum of money to Daegu station, where they would see their children. For a moment, the family's hopes soared. Finally, there was an answer. They gathered the money and headed to the train station with the police. They waited for 10, 20, 30 minutes, even waiting up to an hour, but no one showed up. It was a cruel hoax. 6 days after the boys' disappearance, word started to reach the media. The first news broadcast aired 5 boys still missing after trying to catch frog eggs, a phrase that gave this case its infamous nickname. Within days, the story exploded into a citywide story, and soon the whole country knew about the missing frog boys. 5 children had disappeared without a trace, and South Korea was about to become engrossed in a mystery that would span years. Once the media took hold of the Frog Boy story, public concern ignited, and the police began to take it more seriously. An unprecedented search effort kicked in, with the South Korean government announcing a reward of 42 million won for any information leading to the boys' return. An estimated 320,000 police, military, and volunteers scoured more than 140,000 locations across the country in hopes of finding the children. The boys' photos and details were broadcast on television and printed on 22 million flyers that were distributed in cities and villages. Their faces even appeared on everyday items: cigarette packs, postcards, VHS videotapes, any medium that might catch a citizen's eye. South Korea, freshly emerging into democratic reforms in the early 1990s, was now united in shock and determination to find the missing boys. But despite the massive mobilization, the search turned up nothing. Police reportedly received over 500 tips, none of which led to the boys. In the weeks and months that followed, hundreds more of such leads came and went. Self-proclaimed psychics and shamans even contacted the families with visions, sending the distraught parents on wild goose chases across the country. In one instance, a shaman even insisted that the boys were in the city of Naju in the far south. The exhausted fathers actually traveled there with their own money and even sifted through garbage on her instruction. They found nothing. One of the father even stated, "No one was able to solve the case of the 5 missing children. Isn't that shameful?" Then came the distrust of the authorities. On the 4th of May, 6 weeks after the disappearance, the parents were invited to speak live on a national TV program. It was called The Square of Public Opinions. The fathers stood before the entire country, voicing their anger at the lack of progress. They criticized the police for labeling the children as runaways in official pamphlets.
그리고 마지막으로 내가 말씀드리고 싶은 것은 이 전단을 보시면 아시겠지만은 처음에부터 시작해가지고 계속 전단은 실종으로 이렇게 내나왔습니다. 그런데 마지막 이번에 당국에서 내놓는 거 10만 장 정리해 뿌리는 거는 완전히 돌려가지고 가출로 몰아붙여가지고 이렇게 나왔습니다. 그러면은 우리 보호자 저의 입장에서는 이 사건을 마무리 지우자, 가출로 없애가지고 마무리 지우자 하는 엉터리 없는 수사 당국의 행보라고밖에 볼 수 없습니다.
The broadcast had an immediate impact. Because of the public outcry, then President Roh Tae-woo made a statement personally urging for the case to be investigated further. And in the weeks after the program, thousands of police and soldiers refocused on Mount Waryong. This continued for up to a year after the boys' disappearance. But alas, nothing came up. By the end, any solid trace would have been gone to the elements of nature. The police were simply following orders to comb the area. The situation was looking increasingly grim. As the years passed, the search effort wound down, and public attention gradually faded. But the boys' families never gave up. The 5 fathers quit their jobs and banded together, dedicating themselves full-time to finding their sons. But then, strange things started to happen. The father noticed that they were being followed by shadowy people everywhere they went. These shadowy people would record the father's schedules, their whereabouts, and who they spoke to. It was later found out that these people were from a government intelligence agency. Their purpose remains unknown. After 3 arduous years of ceaseless searching, the families were deep in debt and emotionally drained. They could no longer sustain the search. So, in 1994, they made the painful decision to scale back their search and return to some semblance of a normal life. By the mid-1990s, the mystery of the Frog Boys had settled into an uneasy silence. No clues, no answers, just 5 empty seats at 5 dinner tables in a village in Daegu. However, one thing was on everyone's minds. News reports and media outlets had consistently reported on the nearby military base on Mount Waryong, suggesting a correlation. This was a bold allegation, one that would implicate the government, and conveniently, the military was never fully investigated. The parents were obviously suspicious of this, but they couldn't do anything. But just as they were about to give up, all 5 families received a mysterious call. On the other line was the South Korean military. In a bizarre twist, the military contacted the parents asking if they could see them, but the military had one condition. The parents must not let the police know about this meeting. That's very suspicious. The parents agreed, and they were brought into a large tent in the military base. That's when things got very weird. They were greeted by a military official. He states his reason for bringing them in. He was here to give the parents supernatural powers to find their missing children. The empowered one would then be able to locate the children. One by one, the military official pressed his hands on the sides of the parents' heads. At first, nothing seemed to be happening until one of the wives started talking uncontrollably. The soldiers told the parents to follow her.
군인들이 앞장서고 가자 흔들어. 비가 오면은 신이 땅에 붙어가지고 질퍽질퍽에 붙어가지고 발걸음이 잘 안 떨어지는 그런 실정인데 우리는 이제 길을 받은 그 사람 뒤만 따라간단 말입니다.
Then finally, she screamed, "The children are here, but she would turn out to be wrong, and nothing ever came out of this bizarre exercise. And this is the part of the story that really baffled me. Like, what was the military trying to do? Were they trying to guilt-trip the family into confessing a crime? Or was this some kind of psychic program test like the American Project Stargate? The South Korean military is definitely suspicious, and this suspicion would only grow upon the discovery of the boys' remains. For 11 long years, the Frog Boys' parents had clung onto the hope that their children might still be alive. But that hope was shattered on September 26, 2002, when the mystery of the boys' disappearance was at last partially solved. On that day, two locals foraging for acorns on Mount Waryong stumbled upon a tangle of old clothes and human bones in a narrow gully on the hillside. The location was shockingly close to home, roughly 2 kilometers from the boys' village, near the path they had been known to take, and suspiciously just outside the area that the police had supposedly searched back in 1991. Word quickly spread and the police rushed to cordon off the site. The parents of the boys hurried to the site, and what they saw was devastating. In a shallow depression among the rocks lay the remains of their 5 beloved children. Only bones and fragments of clothes were left. The skeletons were jumbled together, as if the boys had died in a group. Some personal items were identifiable, like pieces of their jackets and shirts, bits of shoes, and a set of dental braces that belonged to one of the boys. The question of where these boys were was finally resolved. All this time, they had just been a few hundred meters from their homes. But almost immediately, the discovery raised disturbing questions. Something was very strange about how the remains were found. For example, one child's body was discovered in an odd posture. The boy's trousers were pulled up over his shoulders, and the sleeves of his jacket were tied together. Why would the boy do that? When investigators untied that knot, a chilling clue tumbled out. Inside the clothing were bullet casings and a few unused bullets. One was even found inside his underwear. Then came forensic expert Professor Chae Jong-min. When he arrived on the site, he was appalled by the mishandling of evidence by the police. The local police had carelessly dug out the bones and piled them together on newspapers, contaminating the evidence. They also made the fatal mistake of sorting the bones by size, putting long leg bones in one group and skulls in another. This muddled the context of how the bodies were positioned upon discovery, a crucial factor in a crime scene. It was an awful scene, and one that showed how unprepared the system was in 2002 to handle a case like this. But just within days of the discovery, the police would make yet another mistake. They hastily judged that the boys had died from hypothermia, that they had gotten lost and succumbed to the cold weather. However, that was impossible because the bodies were found buried, not lying on top of the soil, and they were only roughly 2 kilometers away from home. If it was truly cold and raining, it would only take 5 minutes for the boys to run home. Mountaineering experts have even been called in, and although the weather was cold that day, it was not enough for them to die of hypothermia. All it takes is just some common sense. So why did the police make such a hasty assumption?
현재 드러난 여러 가지 정황을 볼 때는 이런 저체온사일 가능성이 가장 높은 거로 저희들은 추정합니다.
뭐 파가지고 묻은 흔적?
예, 그런 것보다는 왜냐하면은 여기가 당시에 그날 지방자치 선거한 날이었는데 비가 왔습니다. 비가 왔고 당시 최저 기온이 3도로 되어 있지만 비가 오고 날씨 흐린 이런 날에는 산에서는 훨씬 더 그러니까 느끼는 그 체감 온도가 더 낮습니다. 더 낮고 또 같이 엉켜 있는 그런 상태고.
Within 24 hours, the remains of the boys were transported to a lab for forensic examination, and what they found was even more puzzling. The forensic team at Kyungpook National University came to an undeniable conclusion that this was a case of foul play. The boys had not died from cold or starvation. They had been killed by violent trauma. The forensic report described dozens of impact marks on the skulls of Woo Chol-won, Kim Jong-sik, and Kim Yong-gyu. On Woo's skull, they counted 25 separate damage points. On Jong-sik's and Yong-gyu's, at least 10 each. These were a mix of blunt force trauma and stabbing or or cutting wounds. To sum up, the forensic team concluded that the boys were bludgeoned and slashed with weapons, resulting in massive head injuries and fatal bleeding. Images of the remains were also sent to an anthropologist in the US, who confirmed that the injuries were made before their deaths and that it was man-made. Another specialist who conducted geological tests on the burial site concluded that the layering of sediment showed that someone had shoveled earth over the corpses, confirming that it was an intentional concealment and not covered naturally. However, it was impossible to determine the precise cause of death of each child, as many critical pieces of evidence have been lost to time and the police mishandling of the evidence. It was reported that the forensic team had to discount everything that the police touched because it had been damaged or contaminated. But forensics were certain of one thing, that this was murder, and perhaps an institutional cover-up. By this point, 11 years had passed. If it were truly murder, the suspect would have had an 11-year head start to cover his tracks, and that's not very good. By early 2006, 4 years after the discovery of the remains, no arrests had been made. It had been 15 years after the boys' initial disappearance, and the statute of limitations would expire for the Frog Boys case. This meant that if a perpetrator had been identified after that date, prosecutors would have been unable to indict them. Whoever was responsible for these murders might forever escape legal reckoning. Till this day, this case remains unsolved. Frustratingly, no one has even been charged or even arrested for the murder of the boys. However, many theories did arise. One of the earliest theories was that the boys had been abducted because just months earlier, a notorious child kidnapping case had made headlines, putting many parents on edge. The Frog Boys' disappearance initially seemed like a similar abduction scenario. After all, the fact that the 5 children vanished together seemed like an organized kidnapping. Hundreds of supposed sightings and tips poured in during the first year of the search, suggesting that the boys were taken to various parts of the country. However, no credible witness ever reported seeing the boys with an adult stranger, and tragically, or not, no kidnapper ever contacted the families with a genuine ransom demand, other than the cruel prank calls. By the late 1990s, most investigators and family members doubted that an outsider abduction was the answer. But what if it was an inside abduction? In the mid-1990s, a shocking accusation arose that one of the fathers himself might have been involved. A South Korean professor and self-proclaimed criminal psychologist Kim Ga-won publicly claimed that the children's remains were buried under the home of Kim Jong-sik's family. This professor, who had studied in US, alleged that Kim Jong-sik's father couldn't account for his time on the morning the boys vanished. He insinuated that he was the one who killed all 5 boys and had hidden them on his property. This led to the very surreal excavation of Kim's family home. Crowds of neighbors and TV reporters looked on as Kim's outdoor toilet was destroyed. An excavator was even brought in to dig under his yard. But in the end, the search turned up no evidence of any bodies in the house, and it did more harm than good to the already grieving father. He was accused of the murder of his own son, all while watching his family's home being destroyed. Kim unfortunately passed away from liver cancer just a few years later. The accuser, Kim Ga-won, was forced to flee the scene. He later issued an apology and was fined for defamation, but personally, I don't think it was enough. But perhaps the most chilling theory is one that involves the people who were meant to protect the military. From early on, Mount Waryong's military presence loomed over the entire case, and it's definitely very suspicious. The hill was home to a South Korean army base and a shooting range used for live fire drills. The path toward the hill would have taken the boys very near these military facilities. Some wondered, what if an accident at the shooting range caused the boys' death? Because a chilling account actually emerged from a witness. One of the boys' school friends reported hearing a burst of gunfire followed by a horrendous scream coming from Mount Waryong around midday on March 26, 1991, the exact date and time that the boys were supposed to be on the hill. The parents themselves heard this story and urged the police to investigate the possibility of an army incident. However, the police seemed reluctant to investigate the military. Authorities did not treat this account as serious evidence, and just like how they treated the father's initial missing person request, they simply brushed it aside. Could soldiers training that day have mistakenly shot the boys and then covered it up? Well, the military consistently denied this. Military officials stated that no training exercise was held on March 26, since it was a national holiday for the elections. But some key details were off. It later came out that even if regular troops were off duty on the holiday, commissioned officers had independent access to the firing range and sometimes went to practice on their own. According to a report, an army officer had indeed fired an M16 rifle on the range that day to use up his leftover ammunition. But we'll never know who this officer is because he was never investigated and his identity was never made public. What's even more troubling is that the boys' remains were found just 100 to 300 meters from the shooting range, and that's very close, well within the lethal range of an M16 rifle. So it's entirely possible that a stray bullet could have hit one of the boys. And remember when bullet casings and unused bullets were found in the boys' clothing? Well, ballistic checks confirmed that those bullets came from the type used at the local army range, the 50th Infantry Division. Perhaps one of the boys was accidentally shot by a stray bullet. The panic shooter then harmed the others to eliminate witnesses and swiftly buried the evidence. In fact, some of the parents believe this exact scenario to be true. It's a serious allegation implicating not just one soldier but a broader military cover-up. However, there are holes in this theory as well. It would have taken the shooter quite a while to get down to where the boys were. So why didn't one of the boys run home to get help? Also, why bash their skulls in? Wouldn't it be cleaner to shoot them quickly? The way the bodies were disposed of was also very sloppy. If it was truly a military cover-up, why not hide the bodies in the base? The base had an incinerator. Why not use it? It was also reported that only one scream was heard that day. Shouldn't there have been many screams if the boys witnessed a killing? The remaining theory is the grimmest, that the Frog Boys were deliberately murdered. Forensic analysis concluded that at least 3 of the boys suffered fatal injuries inflicted by a weapon-wielding attacker. But who could have done such a thing? And why? Some say it was a mentally disturbed individual who randomly encountered the group and attacked them without motive. One forensic scientist noted that the bizarre brutality suggested the work of someone with a deranged mind. However, South Korean police could not find any similar case of a serial offender targeting groups of children in this way before. Other homicide scenarios overlapped with theories we've already discussed, an accidental shooting that turned into intentional murder to cover it up. Perhaps the boys had seen something they weren't supposed to see, like illegal hunting, or maybe even a hidden cache, and they paid for it with their lives. One intriguing detail investigators found was how one child's jacket was tied in knots around his arms and head, almost like a makeshift blindfold. The perpetrator might have covered the boy's eyes with the jacket before striking his head with a weapon, which suggests a deliberate act. Perhaps the killer did not want to look the child in the eyes. But we'll never truly know what exactly happened to the 5 boys that day. In 2005, after the case had been revealed as a murder, the 5 families sued the South Korean government for negligence, arguing that the police failed to properly investigate crucial leads and had sloppy handling of evidence. But unfortunately, the court ruled against the families. They had 3 trials and the parents lost all of them. To the parents, it felt like the system was trying to avoid admitting fault. Kang Ji-won, the lawyer who represented the families, suggested that a deeper conspiracy might explain the investigative failures. Remember, it was a sensitive time in South Korea in 1991. The military was an esteemed institution, and then President Roh Tae-woo was a former general. Accusing the military of wrongdoing would have been politically explosive. To protect its reputation, powerful forces could have discouraged a thorough probe of the army's involvement. But this remains a theory, as no smoking gun has ever been found. But one thing is clear: the institutions that were meant to deliver justice fell short, and 5 families were left with the aching certainty that more could have been done. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing to the channel to support the work we do and to stay notified of our future videos. And I wish all of you a blessed week ahead, and I will see you guys very soon. Peace.